From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Walt Fick will talk about herbicide options for controlling woody brush in pastures. Based on the latest K-State field trials, Walt will offer his recommendations on late spring, early summer applications to buckbrush, smooth sumac, and roughleaf dogwood. Then one of the featured speakers at the K-State Symposium on Bovine Anaplasmosis, which took place here in Manhattan yesterday, from the University of Tennessee, Brian Whitlock, will talk about ongoing research accounting for the various strains of this disease in cattle herds as a baseline for developing effective means of preventing it. And K-State's Charlie Lee talks this week about Canada goose damage control. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome once again to Agriculture Today on this, the K-State Radio Network, and a word for you pasture managers on this segment, those of you who routinely contend with one or more of a trio of woody brush species. We're talking once again with Range and Pasture Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Walt Fick. Walt, the three that have our attention are buckbrush, roughleaf dogwood, and smooth sumac. And these are, in fact, quite prevalent throughout a fair part of our native grasslands in Kansas, aren't they?
Yes, those 3 shrub species are quite common throughout the Flint Hills for sure, but you'll also see them as you go further west. There's some related species to buckbrush that we might run into in north central, northwest Kansas. One we call coralberry, but buckbrush also occurs. So they are pretty widespread in the state.
And if they are left unchecked, they can become quite competitive with our grasses, and that's the whole point of control.
They do tend to spread out if you don't do anything with them. They're all native species, so they have some typical habitats that we might find them in, but like, for instance, the smooth sumac and dogwood to a certain extent tend to occur sometimes in the steeper slopes or rocky soils, and I don't get too concerned if that's where they stay. Mm-hmm. But like I say, if you don't do something to knock them back, they'll tend to spread out. They both have quite the underground root systems that allow them to spread out and form pretty dense colonies.
Now, there are assorted chemical options for control of each of these 3. And generally, talking of all 3, we're in a window of time now where we can effectively treat for each of these. Is that fair?
I think so. I think here in the next month, we ought to be able to do a pretty good job on all 3 of these species. I've already had some contacts about buckbrush, for instance, and that's one that right now would be a good time. Some of these, when they bloom, is usually a good sign for us in terms of timing. That's not real obvious on buckbrush, so I look at more at maybe leaf maturity. As the buckbrush leaves, they kind of change from a light to a darker green color, and that's a pretty good sign that's about when you want to start thinking about spraying it. But I've had good success treating buckbrush simply with 2,4-D. I think the low volatile ester formulations are more effective on buckbrush than an amine formulation would be, but 3 to 4 pints of a 2,4-D low volatile ester, I've had good success, even treating up to the 1st of June.
Mm-hmm. There are other herbicides we should mention as well that could work against buckbrush, so one has a spectrum to choose from, right?
And I think that may depend on, particularly if maybe you have some other things you want to treat at the same time, maybe that 2,4-D is not as effective on. One of those would be Grazon P plus D, so that's got picloram in it as well as the 2,4-D, and that one will work well. And again, that's 2 to 3 pints per acre. And then another product would be chaparral, which has aminopyrrolid and metsulfuron in it. I like to stick a little 2,4-D with that product, though, so maybe 2 ounces of the chaparral and a couple pints of 2,4-D. That one probably can help extend the window of opportunity a little bit better than just straight 2,4-D.
How about the roughleaf dogwood? The first thing to consider is when would be the best time to treat with respect to the progress of that plant.
Yes, of these 3 shrub species we're talking about, roughleaf dogwood is by far the most difficult to control with herbicide. And what we look for is when it starts to bloom. And that's going to vary, from year to year. But typically, end of May, early June, you'll start to see roughleaf dogwood blooming. And so that's the time. And actually, from the bloom stage even into maybe late bloom, early seed production, there's going to be a 2 or 3 week period there when it's going to be pretty susceptible to some herbicides.
And again, a choice one can make for these foliar applied products. Do they basically perform similarly, Walt?
Well, yes, the 3 I'll talk about all will provide fairly similar control, although maybe the one I'll give you is maybe a little bit more effective. But we've screened a number of herbicides on roughleaf dogwood, and just about anything seems to defoliate it. But if you wait for a year, you'll see a lot of plants coming back depending on what you use. So one of the better products we found is Pasture Guard, HL. That's just a higher load product than they originally came out with. And when you treat individual clumps, where you're maybe mixing up a solution, something like a half to a 1% solution of Pasture Guard, and that should provide at least 50% mortality, if not better. Now, that's not a real high number, but as I've said, dogwood is pretty tough one to kill. Mm-hmm. Of course, Pasture Guard is not a restricted use compound, so that might be important to some people. Surmount, though, is quite effective, and it contains picloram in it, so it is a restricted use product. And again, maybe that 1% solution of Surmount will provide pretty good control. The other one, and it's one that we use or often recommend when we have mixed stands of brush, you mix 3 different herbicides together. So if you mix picloram and 2,4-D and triclopyr together, those 3 herbicides, and so we can do that with Tordon 22K plus 2,4-D plus Remedy Ultra, or we could take the Grazon P plus D, which is a mixture of the picloram and D. If you use about a 1% of that product and about a 0.5% then of the Remedy, that's among the better treatments. And if I was going to, most of the time we don't have to broadcast spray. We're spot spraying, and so those percent solutions work pretty well, and they're just all done in water. But if I was going to broadcast spray on dogwood, what I would use is probably 2 pints of 2,4-D, a pint of Tordon 22K, and a pound of Remedy Ultra. And we found that is probably the most effective treatment. And if you're going to broadcast spray, that's probably the cheapest of all those I've talked about.
One's objective here with dogwood may, though, be just to reduce that stand, open it up for grass growth, and potentially pushing fire through it at some point then.
Yes, I think the combination in the long run will be quite useful. And again, if you're starting with pretty thick or dense stands, you probably would start with a herbicide first and then start using fire. In some cases, though, you could reverse that, as well.
Well, then, Walt, how about smooth sumac and addressing it? When's the best time physiologically to treat with a herbicide there?
Yeah, it's about the same time as dogwood, although it might be slightly later. Again, what I look for is the early seed heads that come out on smooth sumac. And like I say, to me, they remind me of an open head of milo. Mm-hmm. That's what they start to look like. So they'll be in that stage, for a couple of weeks. Again, generally early to mid-June is when that's going to occur.
And as far as treatment, do you consider smooth sumac the perhaps easiest of the 3 to control with a basic herbicide?
Yes, it definitely is quite easy if you hit it at that right timing at least. And 2,4-D does a very good job. Even the amine formulations, 2 to 3 pint per acre of a 2,4-D amine applied at that stage when it's just heading out has been very effective. These bunch of other herbicides will work, but I'm not sure why you would do that at this point in time, at least, because 2,4-D is going to be by far the cheapest treatment.
I want to look at one other consideration here. There are soil-applied herbicide products that could be put out there. Are they at all effective against any or all of these 3 woody brush species?
Well, the one that we typically would think about is called Spike 20P. Typically, though, we put it out during the dormant period. Yeah. The other one that does work on smooth sumac and dogwood is called Pronone Power Pellets. The active ingredient in that one is hexazinone, which is the same active ingredient that we find in Valpar. Some people might be familiar with that product. And again, for these multi-stem shrubs that we're talking about, generally you put out a certain amount per unit area, and I think the rate is like 1 to 2 pellets for 3 foot of canopy. 3 foot of canopy diameter. That's only an area of like 7 square feet or so. So that's, if you got bigger clumps than that, you're going to have to up that number. In fact, if I had an area, maybe, it's 20 by 20 feet, I might put these pellets maybe out in a grid pattern within the stand, and I think they would be more effective applied in that fashion. And I should mention that the Pronone Power Pellets are not put out during the dormant period. You put them out this time of the year when we do expect some rainfall to help incorporate that dry material into the soil.
Well, once more, you can turn to the Chemical Weed Control Guide out of K-State. The 2019 edition is out there, and it lists all the information on these research-tested options that Walt has mentioned. Also, in a recent Agronomy e-Update newsletter out of K-State, Walt does cover in full in that article control options for buckbrush, roughleaf dogwood, and smooth sumac in our grassland areas, dated May the 10th. Agronomy.ksu.edu is where you find that. Walt, we appreciate the input. Many thanks to you. Walt Fick with us, Range and Pasture Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on this Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. The College of Veterinary Medicine at K-State hosting this week an important meeting of experts from all around the state and the country addressing the prominent issue of anaplasmosis disease in beef cattle production. It's a growing concern. Lots of perspectives were lent to this topic, including those of our guest now. He talked about the scope, if you will, of anaplas in the country. He is Dr. Brian Whitlock from the University of Tennessee, an associate professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine there. And you have some background in this area. You've been involved with quite a few survey efforts to track this disease. But, Brian, what is it about anaplasmosis that seems to be so pressing right now in your view?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a couple of things. One, in areas that the disease is not thought to have been endemic, in areas like East Tennessee where I'm from, and when the disease has moved into those herds, in herds that we call naive, they've never experienced the disease before, and anaplasmosis, a cow is carrying persistently anaplasma marginality, are introduced into those herds, we have some really acute die-offs in those herds. So I've seen with my own eyes, my own clients struggle with acute deaths of a quarter to a third or more of their herds dying. So that's one aspect of the disease that's been very challenging for our farmers in East Tennessee, as well as I'm sure farmers here in Kansas. Moreover, the subclinical losses associated with this disease are really hard to understand completely. Moreover, it's difficult to understand how the control measures are being implemented, and if we're using antibiotics judiciously, if we don't understand the prevalence of the disease and the geospatial distribution of the disease across the greater U.S. and the region I'm from, the southeast U.S. So when I think about this disease, I would say the reason that I'm working with people like Dr. Coetzee and Dr. Chika Okafor and others in publishing the reports, it's primarily to get a better grasp on the seroprevalence of the disease, because it's been so long since a regional seroprevalence was done.
So it is widespread, it is costly to cattle producers, of course, and how it afflicts the animals with anemia and oftentimes death. You talked about some things you're deeply involved with at the University of Tennessee in trying to get a hand on the pulse of just how prevalent it is, how intensive it is. Two particular areas of study here, right?
Yes, that would be correct. I worked with Dr. Coetzee back in 2012, and we wrote a proposal to the American Association of Bovine Practitioners, who funded this research that we're currently publishing. We've published 4 papers in the last year or so and intend to publish several more. That proposal had 2 real purposes. One was to reach out to the diagnostic labs in the states that we classified as the Southeast U.S. And I won't, we had a reason for picking the states we did, but we reached out to the diagnostic labs in those states and we asked them for their submissions and results for those regions, including the where those samples came from across those 14 states, and then the type of test that was used and whether the results were positive or negative. So we used those diagnostic lab data to perform a passive survey. And then the other side of that is we did an active survey in those same 14 states. And the reason we picked these 14 states from the beginning is we had access to some cull cow slaughter facilities in the region, one in Georgia and one in Tennessee. In essence, they received cattle from auction barns or sale barns in those regions. So those were the reasons we targeted those states. And we collected approximately 200 samples from slaughtered beef cows as they went through the slaughter line and captured their back tag identification that could take us back to the state of origin, and with the 2-letter abbreviation, possibly their stockyard of origin, so we could get some idea where those cows are coming from in the state. And then we start looking at those results, the seroprevalence with the diagnostic lab data over a 10-year period, 2002 to 2012, and then we married that or overlaid that with the active survey results from the slaughterhouse survey to see if those prevalence data were complementary or not.
And so you had this 2-tiered study. What did it reveal to you in as far as prevalence?
That's a great question. So we publish those. We're publishing those actively, state at a time, because we're publishing the data from the states that are most complete. Because as you can imagine, when you reach out to these diagnostic labs, we can't always get all the data for different reasons. The software that's used to keep track of the data, the test type used, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't always receive a complete data set. So that was one challenge that we didn't anticipate. And the other thing that I want to stress is not every diagnostic lab in every state used the same type of tests. So it's difficult to compare prevalence from one state to another. So oftentimes we're talking about these prevalences in state by state. So to give you an example, Kentucky's prevalence based on the diagnostic lab data set and the slaughterhouse data set appears to be somewhere around 10 to 13 or 14% seroprevalence. So if you went out and sampled 10 cows, 1 or 2 of them might be seropositive. As opposed to if you go to another state that we've published on, Mississippi, it may be as many as 15% to maybe as high as 20% of those cows are positive. So there's probably some regional seroprevalence that we're looking at, but we're publishing these state by state. The other thing I want to stress is very often the diagnostic lab data was comparable to the active data from the slaughterhouse survey. So that really helps us in believing that in the future it's wise to work with diagnostic labs like the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, who has a good relationship with farmers and veterinarians in the state, and use their data set as an estimate of what possibly the true prevalence is in the region. The other thing I would add was there was a survey done back in the 1970s. McAllen and others did a survey in 1973 of slaughterhouse data, and It appears that some states the prevalence may have gone up, and others it hasn't changed much over the time. We don't completely understand that at this point. Some of it may be dependent on the type of test we used. The test we used 40 years ago had a much lower sensitivity than the test we are using now, such that it makes it difficult to interpret what happened 40 years ago with what happened now. So it may not be possible to say that the prevalence has changed a lot in the last 40 years or not because of the differences in tests.
It sounds as if once prevalence is established to whatever degree is useful, the next thing then is to translate that into mitigation strategies. How do you envision that right now?
Mitigation strategies, right now what we have in our arsenal is use of antibiotics in the way of pulsing or feeding continually, and we're hearing some things here today that possibly we shouldn't be feeding it continuously. But I guess overall, if we can understand the prevalence and distribution of the disease, that will help animal scientists, veterinarians, and policymakers know how to best implement when and where to use judicious use of feed-grade antimicrobials. Vaccines are a little more controversial, I'm sure you're aware, and knowing how and where to implement those could also be implemented having a better idea of the prevalence. Because if you don't know where the disease is more prevalent and less prevalent, then it's harder to control it. And as Dr. Coetzee alluded to earlier, in endemic regions, you get a stable group of animals that are there. And in essence, you don't get these acute die-offs you get with a naive population of animals. So it may even help diagnosticians and veterinarians when it comes to diagnosing these diseases too. So I think it would help in deciding where to use antibiotics and when those would be appropriate. If appropriate and efficacious vaccines are created and shown to be effective through peer-reviewed research, then it could be decided where we implement those. And I would say understanding as a diagnostician, as a veterinarian, if I see these clinical signs, is it more likely anaplasm because it's in the region or not? So I think it's I guess multiple things that understanding the prevalence could allow for.
Well, as somebody who's worked on this problem for quite a while, along with many other practitioners, researchers around the country, your general thought, can the industry get on top of this disease to a satisfactory level?
That's a great question as well. I think that starts with knowing the prevalence of your region and knowing the prevalence of your herd and implementing all the things that are being discussed here today, whether that's tick and fly control, whether that's appropriately using needles, whether that's changing needles every time or reducing the frequency that needles are used, or whether that's using good biosecurity and deciding when animals come into your farm how you're going to screen them for diseases before they enter your herd, if you have a relatively low prevalence herd or not. I think ignorance isn't bliss. I think knowing more about it and knowing more about your herd status will make it where you as a producer are able to control the disease and understand those losses. I think that's really hard to possibly eliminate the disease, for one, because we don't have, at this point, a known efficacious vaccine. I think that would really change things a lot, and that may be something in the near future. And again, I know the vaccine's a controversial subject, but knowing the seroprevalence in the region you're in is certainly going to help. But then I think ultimately immunization and knowing its efficacy will make it better.
Well, Brian, your contributions to this dialogue at the symposium quite important to the overall discussion here. So thank you for coming to Kansas State University, being part of it, and continued good luck in your further work in this area.
Thank you, and I'm appreciative of the organizing body for inviting me and my associate, Dr. Okafor, here to be a part of this group, and we're actually meeting to discuss future research projects in this area. So I have lots of close friends here and anticipate future collaboration will definitely occur.
Appreciate your time. Brian Whitlock, he is an associate professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Tennessee, and he talked about the prevalence of anaplasmosis in the beef cattle industry in the U.S. at the second symposium on bovine anaplasmosis hosted by K-State this week. Agriculture Today returns with more in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And some headway was made in corn and soybean planting here in Kansas last week, thanks to the comparatively open weather. That's according to the USDA in its Crop Progress and Condition Report. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies 27% surplus and 71% adequate, only 2% short to very short. Subsoil moisture, 23% surplus now, 76% adequate, and 1% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop this week, 60%, good to excellent. 30% fair, 10% poor to very poor. Wheat jointing now at 95%, and wheat that's headed at 61%. That's still well behind the 83% average for this date. Corn planting in Kansas, then, 61% complete. That's behind the 80% average. And emergence is at 37%. That's behind the 53% average. Soybean planting at 17% done now, behind the 29% average. And soybean emergence only 6%. That's still near the 10% average for the date. Range and pasture conditions in the state, 71% good to excellent, 26% fair, and 3% poor to very poor. Now for a look at planting progress nationally, we turn to the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Futures prices for many crops have been turning up because of serious planting delays, and those delays may continue.
More storminess is imminent across really the western half, the western two-thirds of the Corn Belt, expecting copious rainfall over the next several days.
Copious. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey, he says, as we started this week, 49% of the nation's corn crop was in the ground, and Rippey told us as you look back,
over the last 3 decades, this is the slowest progress on record for this date.
Nationally, we are 31% behind the 5-year average for corn planting. Some states much farther behind the curve.
Illinois, 65 percentage points behind average. Indiana, 59 points behind the 5-year average of 73%.
Meanwhile, soybeans?
Really, it's the same story there.
Oh, yeah, with only 19% of soybeans planted, the average by now would be 47%. 5 states don't even have 10% of their beans in the ground.
Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, and South Dakota.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Now, the USDA is working to craft a $20 billion trade aid program for crops that largely have yet to emerge from the ground. Expectations high that the number of prevented planting acres could be large. An agricultural policy specialist out of the University of Nebraska, Brad Lubin, says that ideally the USDA would come out quickly and say that a new trade program would be based on historical production and that the rest of the details would be announced after the planting season is over. Now for you this week's edition of Milk Lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning an option maybe to lower some of your production costs and save you some money in the next several months. Many of our farms have been using sex semen, and we actually have an oversupply of available replacement heifers on most of our farms. In the past, this has been all right because we've been able to sell those at a profit. Generally, heifer prices have ranged over $2,000 each for Springer heifers, and sometimes as high as $2,200 to $2,400 apiece. However, in today's dairy market, we're seeing prices that are more like $1,200 to $1,400. So what is the true cost of raising those heifers? Well, the true cost of raising those heifers to the Springer age is probably likely much greater than $1,200 or $1,400. So every animal that we sell at that price, we've probably actually lost money, and it's probably in the neighborhood of maybe $600 to $1,000, depending on our efficiency of raising heifers. So having extra heifers around right now probably isn't a very profitable thing for your dairy. So how do you determine how many heifers you actually need to replace the animals in your herd? Well, there's a simple formula that actually does a pretty good job of estimating that for you. You only need to know 4 numbers. You need to know your herd size. You need to know your average age at first calving, your cull rate, this would include death rate for the herd as well, and the number of heifers or the percentage of heifers that typically do not make it to the Springer stage. This would include death and cull losses through 24 months of life if that's your age at first calving. So, an example, let's say we had 200 cows in the herd. Let's say we had an average calving age of 24 months. Our average cull rate, including death, was 35% annually, and the percentage of heifers not making it to our age at first calving was 12%. And again, this includes culls as well as those animals that might die in the first 2 years of life. So how does that work? Well, we take the 200 cows, we multiply by the age at first calving divided by 24 months. So if we were at 24 months, that was 1. If we were less than that, it would be a fraction of that. Our cull rate was 35%, so we would multiply by that as well. And then we would take in our non-completion rate. We'd take 1 plus whatever the percentage was. So if we were at 12% non-completion rate on heifers, that would be 1.12 is what we'd use as our factor. That would come up to 78.4 animals in this example, times 2, since we're at age of calving of 2 years, would be 156.8 animals or heifers that we would need to have around at any one time. So say 157 to maybe 160. So in your herd, I encourage you to take a look at how many cows you actually have, what your age at first calving is, your annual cull rates, as well as non-completion rates for heifers to reach age at first calving. Figure out what you actually need around the farm, and then begin a process of how we might cull down to that number of animals. Again, if you start with younger animals and trying to make some of those culls, keeping in mind you still need to have enough for replacements in the year that they will calve, might be the best way to save money for the farm. As you look at that, how do you decide which animals to cull? Well, you have genetic information on your animals, so that would be one place to start. You could also use genomic testing. That gives you additional genetic information. And you could also use health records, keeping in mind that those animals that have been treated for pneumonia 1 or more times may be less productive in your herd in the future than those animals that did not have pneumonia during the calf rearing time. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a careful look at their supply of replacement heifers on the farm and maybe consider this formula in determining how many animals they actually need to be successful in the future on their dairy.
All right, Mike, many thanks. K-State's Charlie Lee awaits for his weekly visit next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today, and once more across the way is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. He joins us each Tuesday to talk about another aspect of wildlife management, and they are now abundant in many areas, Canada geese. Charlie, what we want to do is talk about dealing with their nuisance activities, but tell us more about their habits at this time of the year.
Well, this is the time of year that Canada geese are raising young. Probably most of the nests have already hatched. We have young geese that are in the ponds and water bodies. Here in the first part of June to mid-June, even into early July, is when they're going to molt their primary feathers, and that's the time that then they're no longer able to fly. So they're confined basically to the water bodies where they raise their young. And then the damage as they go about their feeding behavior increases at this point in time because they're confined in smaller areas and not able to be dispersed across the countryside. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approximately 15 years ago decided that they didn't want to deal with the goose and human conflicts. So they delegated some of that authority to state agencies. Keep in mind that Canada geese are a federally protected migratory bird, but because of a lot of the problems and the close ties that federal agencies have with the state fish and wildlife agencies, they've developed a resident Canada goose management program. And they allow states to do some things to solve some of those conflicts that previously weren't allowed. Canada geese numbers have grown exponentially over the years. The resident geese are those that typically stay around and don't migrate back and forth north and south, so we have problems a much longer period of time than what we had previously. So when people have complaints about geese, those complaints include people that are frustrated with goose droppings, typically on lawns and beaches and docks and sidewalks, and occasionally the complaints would be geese are nesting in inappropriate areas, perhaps where the public have access, and they're fairly protective, and they can become aggressive towards people who enter the territory around their nest. So those are some of the typical conflicts that we see. The types of control methods that are available also vary widely.
And you say those are established by the state agencies, in our case, the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. What in this state is allowed to alleviate geese damage?
Well, one of the first things that can be done is don't artificially feed geese or other waterfowl. Feeding concentrates the geese. It causes them to lose some of their wild instincts. They may become more aggressive. It can cause some problems with goose nutrition. So the first step is to cease feeding geese or domestic waterfowl on the site. There are also some other types of control, things that we can do for habitat modification. Make sure that the geese don't have an easy access point from the pond directly to the lawn. It doesn't take a very tall fence or shrubbery or tall grass. The geese would prefer to walk from the water body up onto the areas that they're going to feed. Any type of impediment there to restrict their access from the water body to the lawn is going to reduce the conflicts. I've found that it seems to be acceptable to use the short, even a 12-inch high fence. It can be the plastic netting, or it can be string wires. No taller than that seems to be enough of an obstacle to keep most geese off of the lawn during the molting season.
One of the things that folks think of immediately as far as trying to deal with geese would be frightening them away, harassing them in some fashion. And that's allowed under the provisions of the state here, right?
Yes, it's allowed. You can frighten and harass geese. You get into the permitting issue when you're dealing with contacting the geese or their nests or their eggs. But unfortunately, the use of those scaring devices is not as effective as perhaps many people would think. There are a lot of objects on the market, including things like alligator decoys and coyote decoys and hawks and owls that are designed to be put out there, and that's to frighten the geese away. Typically, geese are not frightened by some of those techniques, although there are a lot of people that try them. The things that I have seen work that were frightening techniques would be objects that are overhead, perhaps some mylar balloons that are tethered. Those are some things that cause geese to become more wary and to avoid areas. Mylar tape is just simply a long ribbon tape that's reflective. It can work in some situations, but also it creates a noise as well as that reflective color when the wind blows across that mylar tape. There's been some success with harassing geese with the use of dogs that have been trained to chase geese but not capture or harm them has been a very popular and a successful method. You can just simply chase geese to areas on the water body where they're not causing conflicts. Another fairly simple technique's been the low-power lasers. Even the PowerPoint lasers that you may see in public presentations can effectively disperse geese under low light conditions.
One final thought here, because you always get questions about repellents and if they'll work against Canada geese.
There are some repellents. Methylanthranilate, which is a flavoring product, can be applied to the grass where geese are feeding. It has kind of mixed results. Anthraquinone, another product that's relatively new, it repels geese in two different ways. They experience a gut reaction, a negative gut reaction after eating the grass. And then secondly, the anthraquinone changes the appearance of the grass because it changes the reflectivity of ultraviolet light that's shining on the grass when it's applied to turf. Those products have some application. They're registered. Again, the results are somewhat mixed on how effective they are.
Once again, though, as Charlie says, if you have questions about contending with the Canada goose infestation, do talk with the local wildlife parks and tourism personnel. They can lend you more input on how to go about contending with that the right way. Charlie, thanks for the overview on this. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And that caps off today's edition. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.